Hi, I'm Salek, and this is in honor of. And today we have a very special show. But before we get into that, just to take a few seconds out, we have our co-host Paul Dietrich, and I want to publicly thank Paul because, believe it or not, Paul makes it work. He gets the information. He's so in tune with Veterans Affairs and what's going on that Paul is the guy that will go down to Washington and actually lobby for the organizations, go up to Albany and lobby for the organizations. And he's just on top of everything. And Paul, I just want to publicly thank you because we may have 302 programs now, but you've made most of them happen. And I do appreciate that.
Okay.
Now with that, our guests just happened to be with Paul a couple of weeks ago down in Washington, D.C. And I am truly honored to have a longtime friend, what would we say, 22 years?
Yes, sir.
Figured out 22 years. Dan Donovan and I have been friends, and I want to thank him for coming here to the studio to do a show and talk to us about what's going on with Veterans Affairs. And your hard work is recognized, Dan, and we do appreciate that. And with that, Paul, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Very good. Again, thank you for coming in to talk to us. And again, a lot of this is things we talked about in your office several weeks ago down in D.C., but I just want to make sure that all of the veterans out there hear how certain congressmen are working towards various things that concern all of us as veterans. And hear from the veterans of foreign wars, our number one concern remains sequestration and the effects that it has on just about everything in our government. And
can I interrupt you 1 second? Can you explain sequestration to the public?
well, basically, the budget is capped, and you can't go for more than you're authorized to go for. So budgeting becomes almost impossible. My civilian job, I was a budget manager. I had about $10 million a year. And the federal government, not a lot of money, but I was planning years in advance, usually on the order of 10 years. But with a budget that you don't know what you're going to have for next year, it's almost impossible to budget intelligently. And the whole idea that if you get beyond a certain amount, everything gets reduced, it impacts everything and everything out there that gets done. You have aircraft that can't fly because you can't order parts. You have people that can't go for training. Very simple things, like I'm an advisor up at West Point to the cadets. The perfect time for us to go up and talk to young cadets, like in their first year at West Point, is in the fall when they first get there. We can try to set the stage for their career going forward. We can't do it in the fall because we don't know what the budget's going to be. So now I'm going up next month. So these kids have already been there for 8 months already. They're already kind of set in their ways. It's much more difficult to change anything. Yet that's what we have to do because of the way that sequestration is there. We really need to get out of this, as we've discussed, and get into an intelligent budgeting process, decide what our absolute priorities are, and then get them out years in advance.
You're absolutely right. It's so difficult to plan, and running a government on a yearly basis. Our budget runs from October 1st to September 30th.
Yes.
And without the certainty, the Secretary of the Navy can't go to Home Depot and buy an aircraft carrier.
No.
So planning is essential for our military buildup, and as you know, the President and General Mattis want to build our military back up. You mentioned assets. We cannibalize certain assets to repair damaged ones that are in better shape than the one we're cannibalizing. That's no way to run a military. We're putting women and men in harm's way to protect our freedoms overseas and equipping them with equipment that isn't adequate for their missions.
Absolutely.
General Mattis came to see us, Colonel, and he asked us for $700 billion for 1 year's budget and $716 For the next budget, we gave it to him. He said with those resources, he'll be able to plan, as you're discussing now, and be able to rebuild our military assets to the capabilities that we need. He told us we have the smallest army that we've had since World War I. I think it was the smallest Navy we've had since World War II, and the smallest Air Force that we've had in the history of our country. Now, with our capabilities being probably greater than they were in the past, maybe you don't need as many troops, but you certainly need the assets for the troops that we have. And that's the goal of this Congress.
Absolutely.
I've found, Colonel, that there's no one who is not supportive of our military in Congress. There are some who are more vocal about it, some of us who are more passionate about our current military and our veterans, of course. As you know, I hold a Veterans Roundtable both here in Staten Island and in Brooklyn around once every 2 months. And a lot of the things that we're working on for veterans benefits, whether it be the VA, whether it be housing, whether it be dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, all those things, a lot of those issues come out of these roundtables we have, but one of them certainly is what you're talking about now. That came out of our discussions.
And here's another example of how this type of lock on the budget screws things up. We have a POW and an MIA mission. I mean, it's a horrible thing to be a POW or an MIA. The family, the stress on the family is just unbelievable. Right now, the way the MIA POW mission is, it's almost impossible for the organization to look more than a year in advance. And you know, when you're dealing with foreign countries, when you need to go into a place like Laos, when you need to go into a place like Vietnam, you need to plan these things out. You need to budget for certain resources you need years in advance. But you can't do it with the current. I don't know if there's a way to carve out guaranteed funding for missions like that, as you've done for the military. But this may be something that we need to do, because otherwise we're not going to get to the places where these people were lost, and we're not going to recover those people and get them back to their family.
For those missions and for so many other things, I'm a proponent of a 2-year budget. We do 12 major appropriation bills every year. In fact, this last Congress was the first time in a very long time where we passed all 12 appropriation bills. But if we did 6 appropriation bills each year for a 2-year budget and leapfrog them, we do 6 one year for 2 years, 6 the next year for 2 years, the process, I think, will work better. We could plan for missions, as you've just spoken about, and certainly our military leaders can also plan for the necessities that they require for our troops. And we could certainly take care of our veterans better than we do now. There's nothing, we cannot do enough for the women and men who've put their lives on the line for our freedoms and for their families, and with some of the needs that they have when they come home, whether they be newer vets or veterans who have served in wars in the past. Everyone has different needs.
Yes.
You know, someone coming home now might need some help re-entering civilian life. They might need a job. They might need housing. As we've discussed in one of our roundtables, the disparity that we have in the housing allowance for Staten Island students going to CSI compared to if they had gone out of borough, they get a different allowance.
Yes. Same thing applies if they're still active duty.
Right.
Because they get a different housing allowance. Then I don't understand it.
But why I bring that up, Colonel, is because that issue came out of our roundtable.
Yes.
Those very important and very productive roundtables that we have of our veterans every 2 months.
Good. The only other thing that I'd mention on this subject is, I know you talked about maybe we don't need quite the same force, but having served, when I was in command, the first day after I took command was when the war in Iraq started. And I had a reserve unit, a brigade, that's 1,500 soldiers. I can tell you that for the next 3 years, I was mobilizing almost my entire brigade, 1 unit, 1 soldier at a time. And I had soldiers at that time, this is 2004 area, I had soldiers that were mobilized 3 and 4 times. And these are reservists, so they're coming out of civilian life, getting mobilized for a year, sometimes a year and a half, going back. My own mobilization was 2 years away from the civilian world. Without having the adequate numbers behind you, that's what the stress you're putting on the organizations and on the families. And that's where we need to think realistically about the missions that we've got and how we fulfill the missions by manpower and resources.
I agree with you, Paul. I leave it to our military leaders to decide what is the adequate troop numbers that we have, but you're absolutely right. I've met many veterans who have done 3, 4 tours of duty over in Iraq, Afghanistan, and as we say now, we have an all-volunteer military. I was born in 1956. In 1974, I turned 18 years old. In fact, the fellows who turned 18 in 1956, we were the last people to sign up for the draft. But it was 1974. They were bringing troops home from Vietnam, and then in 75, Saigon fell.
Right.
So none of us got called up. But now with an all-voluntary military, when many of those folks who are serving right now are reservists.
Yes.
And at a time when we had a draft, people who went into the reserves, I suspect, did their weekend a month and 2 weeks during the summer, but there was a rare occasion when they had to be called up.
Yes.
Now our
I'm laughing because I remember my 35 years, and I don't think there was 1 year in 35 that I did a weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, because you're basically doing the mission of an active duty unit part-time.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I was in command, I worked across the river here in New Jersey. Every morning, my chief civilian advisor was on the phone with me for about an hour discussing what was going for. There was no downtime. And every weekend I was traveling because units and men or women were either coming or leaving. And it was just a phenomenally busy time. So it's a very big stressor on life, on your civilian life, on your military life, and on those people participating.
And your family.
Yes, absolutely. The next item I'd like to talk about, and I hate to say this, but my own very small VFW post right now has 3 poster children for community care. We have 2 members who are in nursing homes, and I have another member who just came out of the VA hospital and may have to go back to a nursing home. And part of the reason is because there's not enough community care where the veteran can be taken care of in their home. And 2 of the cases, they're Medicaid recipients. So they're in a nursing home on Medicaid, where the federal government is paying for this, rather than supporting them, supporting the family and keeping the veteran in their home. And to me, it's silly that we're spending money on one case to keep them in a nursing home, which probably isn't the best, where we need to really figure this whole thing out, and how do we take care of these people in their homes, and what can we do to solve this crisis? Because we're all getting older. This is something that all of us have, unfortunately, to look forward to. And I mentioned House Resolution 1005 and Senate Resolution 2193, which are talking specifically about caring for veterans and trying to keep them in their homes whenever possible. So I'd ask you to talk a little bit about that.
It's certainly the best care. I mean, my mother wasn't a veteran, but I was fortunate enough during her 4 years of suffering from Alzheimer's to be able to keep her home with care at home. And certainly it's a better setting for our veterans to be at home as they're being cared for, rather than being...
Absolutely.
And for a family to receive help. It's a real struggle for families to care for somebody at home at the same time having their own responsibilities. Yes. So yes, there are 2 bills, companion bills, one in the Senate, one in the House. We would like to see passed, we'd like to see the President sign. And again, there's an economic value to this as well, as you point out, Colonel, but it's the care for that veteran that's much more important than even the economic value. And to allow them to be in the comfort of their home. Again, my mother wasn't a veteran, but I experienced that for 4 years in my own family. And it goes back to what I said, and a lot of these issues, that one in particular came up also in one of our roundtables. And it's, again, not being able to do enough for people. And, you know, some of our younger veterans coming home now, a lot of their injuries aren't visible.
Yes.
A lot of their injuries are dealing with what they had witnessed, what they had participated in during a war, and to allow us the proper way to handle their injuries, their internal injuries, is something that we've been dealing with as well with you and the group.
Yes.
And then our aging population, you're right, it's a good thing, by the way, that we're all getting older.
Yes, it is.
That their needs are different. So we have to be specific and not just blanketly say this is what's good for all veterans. We have to look at each individual, if not case, each individual group, whether it be by age, whether it be by what missions they were on, whether it be what they're suffering from, and deal with those properly.
The other thing I will point out, and this is actually a positive, is right now on Staten Island, we have a VA-sponsored program up at the Seaview. And there is veterans daycare available 2 days a week, paid for by the VA. And programs like that are extremely successful. It gets the veteran out of the house, gets them to a place where they can interact with other veterans, which is important. And also they have the rehabilitation efforts that they might need there. All of that is provided. And it brings the veteran out of the house so that the family can maybe go shopping, get some things that they need. Very important program, and not well known, but very effective. So I just bring that to you for your attention. It's a very good program. If it could be expanded, that would even be better.
It's well attended.
Yes.
Well attended. I've been up there. There's a enormous number of vets that come in, and they pick them up by bus. They bring them in. You don't have to
go on day
transport
trips.
them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's
all important types of things.
Sure, and there's a camaraderie. I mean, we have found, my dealings with the VA, is that veterans dealing with veterans is more successful than having civilians deal with veterans. And there's occasions where you need civilian input, but even when I go visit the VA hospital over in Brooklyn, there are veterans that are there 7:30 in the morning in the lobby, having coffee, talking to their fellow veterans. It's a social atmosphere as well as one where we're caring for their health. And finding people who specifically deal with a veteran's issue, like the doctors over there, they deal with all veterans, is different than maybe some of the younger folks coming home from war would rather go to their own physician, and we have the Veterans Choice Act allowing veterans to choose whether or not they want to go to a physician or they want to go to the VA. But I've found as the daycare program and the folks who use the VA facilities, that it's veterans being with veterans. It's people in charge who are only dealing with veterans, so they know the aspects of a veteran's life that need attention. So it's a wonderful thing, that program.
We mentioned just briefly before about toxic exposures, and you talked a little bit about the Blue Water Navy. That's a very important act. To me, as an engineer, it's difficult to understand, because I know how a ship makes fresh water, as do you. I mean, they boil it. Basically, they boil seawater.
Evaporators. Yeah, they take seawater and they just,
So a ship sailing in the ocean, taking the seawater in, everybody on that ship is exposed to whatever's in that water. And right now you have people with the same symptoms as Agent Orange exposure, and one ship is covered, one ship is not. And House Resolution 299 is talking about that.
Rectifying that difference.
Excellent.
I don't know how our sailors were distinguished or left out of the benefits that were given to other military personnel who were exposed to Agent Orange, but unfortunately they were.
The school of thought was they weren't boots on the ground.
Yes.
Right.
Army and Marines were boots on the ground. They were in country fighting. The
Whatever
sailors were
fell in
off on the
Vietnam
shore.
washed into the ocean.
Right, but no one realized this, or they ignored it. There's only two answers here. Either they realized it and ignored it, or they never realized that our sailors were being exposed to the same deadly chemicals as the boots on the ground, as you say, Ed.
Yeah.
So we're rectifying that, Colonel. You know, our sailors deserve the same care and the same resources as our Marines and our soldiers did. During that conflict where, again, Americans went to Southeast Asia to protect the interests of our nation.
The other one that's out there is House Resolution 3605, which talks about personnel that served on the DMZ in Korea. And right now, while they were using Agent Orange chemicals for a 1.5 year period, only 1 year is covered. So you have one veteran who served during the 6 months that aren't covered. He gets no treatment. And the other veteran, I have a veteran in my post who has all of this problems of Agent Orange. He served luckily during the period, or unluckily, I would say, and he's being treated, but the other is not. And it's just, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't pass, I'm sorry, the smell test, as I would say. If the stuff was there, and you served in that area, I'm sorry, but you should be covered. And again, that's House Resolution 3605.
Again, trying to rectify something that was either a mistake, ignored, or these brave individuals were purposely excluded. For what reason, Paul, I don't know.
Yep.
We're hoping to resolve it for them.
I think some of the psychology behind all of this was, if you go back to Vietnam and right after it ended, the overall mentality in the country was
We wanted to forget
Vietnam
about
was a bad thing.
Yes.
And I was a bad guy for serving during Vietnam, as were many, many others. It was not uncommon to be spit on when you're in uniform.
Ed, I remember how poorly our soldiers, airmen, and sailors were treated when they came home. They were called baby killers. And remember, there was a lot of people protesting that war. It was a time, may have been the first war that was televised.
Right.
That Americans heard about what happened during World War II, heard about what happened in World War Korea, and then Vietnam they actually saw.
Right.
And you know, the protests on college campuses, and again, brave women and men were called to service, and they answered that call.
Yep.
I don't know of so many people that wished they had gone there. They went because their country asked them to, and they felt the responsibility and a duty.
Most places you don't want to go.
You don't want to go, Paul, but these, the folks like yourself, Ed, like you, Colonel, all answered the call of their nation. And they were treated so poorly, and our country didn't do anything to help the return. And they didn't want to get involved in parades. They weren't offered parades, as we did with our heroes who came back from other wars.
Right.
They didn't want to join any of the VFWs or American Legion
In fact,
posts,
some were turned away at those organizations,
which is a shame.
which is a very
Veterans
big
turning
shame.
away other veterans.
Yes.
But a lot of them wanted to just forget about it, or as you say, Ed, didn't want to be associated with that bad. And remember, we called it a war. Everybody else called it a conflict.
Yeah.
But the people coming home, unfortunately, instead of being proud that they served their country, were treated so much so that many were ashamed. And no one should be ashamed of their service to this nation.
A lot of grave sites are filled with guys who went to a conflict.
You bet. Remember we used to talk about 55,000 people. You could fill Yankee Stadium with the people who gave the ultimate sacrifice during the Vietnam War.
Right.
Veterans health care, we discussed during the time in Washington about right now there's a co-payment, for example, for preventative medications from the VA. That just makes no sense to me. We want to prevent illness. If it's preventative, there should be no copay, just like it is in the civilian world. very much we need to increase the gender specifically for female veteran care. In fact, later this year, we plan to have a show with 3 or 4 of our women veterans talking with the VA specifically. They really resent when they walk in and get addressed as a dependent, since we have quite a few female veterans. And 20 veterans a day committing suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them are actually older veterans, not the younger veterans just coming back. And I attribute it, this is just me, to when we release veterans, we really don't do a good job of linking them directly into the VA and getting them evaluated for the stressors that they've been under, PTSD, things like that. And I really think that we need to force that issue and make it happen.
Yeah, this separation of service from military life to civilian life. Our military is supposed to help people during that transition, and many times it's a short period of time, 3 months before your separation, 6 months before your separation, and it's a one-time session, and 6 months later,
You're out.
You're on your own.
You're on the street.
You're on the street. And you may be on the street without housing, without job prospect. One of the things we were able to do, because so many of our veterans have clearances that civilians don't have. So many have been trained in specialties that civilian world needs people with those skills. So we've tried to help with veterans who already have clearances, already have the training, transition them into jobs. One of the areas in the maritime industry, they already have the clearances to go into the maritime industry. They don't have to wait for these background investigations. They've already been vetted by our country and our military. So these are some of the ways that we're trying to help our veterans transition, but their health, Colonel, their mental well-being are so important to us.
We've got to destigmatize it.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but Congressman, if I can ask you to come back again, we'd love to have you back anytime. And we'd also love to join you when you have your roundtables.
You're both welcome. Paul already participated. You're both welcome. And I want to thank the two of you for holding this, because many of our veterans who may be home right now and can't come out to one of our roundtables are getting a lot of information from the show that you guys are producing and conducting here. So I want to thank you on behalf of the United States Congress and our nation for your care and your desire to help our veterans. Thank you.
We've been watching in honor of. We love you for watching, and we keep bringing you information. And I just want to thank the Congressman once again for being here, and thank Paul. You just keep watching. God bless you. We love you.